Ralph Waldo Emerson, who went by his middle name Waldo, was an American essayist, lecturer, philosopher, and poet who led the transcendentalist movement of the mid-19th century. As a young man, Emerson followed the traditional path, first attending Harvard and then becoming a minister like his father. But after the death of his wife, he began to question the rigid structures of faith and society. His growing disillusionment eventually led to a ban from Harvard due to his controversial views. After returning to America, Emerson published Nature, a work that would become the foundation of transcendentalism. A year later, his speech The American Scholar was hailed by Oliver Wendell Holmes as America's intellectual declaration of independence. Through his essays and lectures, Emerson advocated for self-reliance and the search for truth beyond institutions. His influence expanded as he mentored Henry David Thoreau. Emerson's path to becoming one of America's most influential thinkers began long before he put his ideas into writing. His early life, education, and the experiences that shaped his worldview all contributed to the philosophy he would later share with the world. Emerson was born in Boston, Massachusetts on May 25, 1803, into a family of Unitarian ministers. His father, William, was a highly respected preacher known for his weekly sermons and intellectual influence. Emerson's childhood was marked by hardship. His father died of stomach cancer in 1811, just weeks before his 8th birthday, leaving the family in financial difficulty. His mother, Ruth Haskins Emerson, raised him and his siblings with the support of his formidable Aunt Mary. Mary was an independent and fiercely intellectual woman who played a significant role in shaping Emerson's thinking, encouraging his love for literature, philosophy, and self-reflection. She corresponded with him throughout his life, offering guidance. At the age of 9, Emerson enrolled at Boston Latin School, where he developed a passion for language and classical studies. By the age of 14, he was admitted to Harvard College. It was an extraordinary achievement for someone so young. Although he initially studied theology, he found himself increasingly drawn to literature and philosophy. During his time at Harvard, he encountered the works of Plato, Eastern philosophy, and romantic poets such as Wordsworth and Coleridge. He supported himself through various jobs, which included tutoring and waiting tables, all while maintaining a journal that documented his evolving thoughts. After graduating in 1821, Emerson began teaching at his brother's school. More on that later. He spent 2 years living in a secluded cabin in Roxbury, where he studied nature and further developed his ideas on individuality and self-reliance. In 1826, Emerson's health began to decline. He went to seek a warmer climate. He first traveled south to South Carolina, then to Florida, where he spent his days walking the beaches and writing poetry. While in St. Augustine, he made the acquaintance of Achille Murat, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. Murat was his senior and was a free-spirited thinker who introduced Emerson to radical political and philosophical ideas. They became good friends and enjoyed each other's company. The two had enlightening discussions about religion, society, philosophy, and government. Emerson considered Murat an important figure in his intellectual education, yet not all his experiences in the South were enlightening. At one point, he attended a meeting of the Bible Society while a slave auction was taking place in the yard outside. He later wrote of the unsettling contrast. One ear therefore heard the glad tidings of great joy, whilst the other was regaled with going, gentlemen, going. These early years, marked by personal loss, intellectual exploration, and encounters with new ideas, laid the foundation for the philosopher Emerson would become. With a growing interest in philosophy and literature, he now stood at the threshold of his true calling. After completing his studies at Harvard, Emerson worked alongside his brother William, teaching at a school for young women in their mother's house. When William left for Europe, he briefly ran his own school in Chelmsford before closing it and continuing to teach in Cambridge. Later that year, he was accepted into Harvard Divinity School. During this time, Emerson's younger brother Edward suffered a mental breakdown and was placed in an asylum. Though he later recovered, he died in 1834 from tuberculosis. Another brother, Charles, died from the same illness just 2 years later. These losses deeply affected Emerson, reinforcing his growing philosophical outlook on life and death. In 1827, Emerson met Ellen Tucker, whom he married 2 years later. Tragically, Ellen was already suffering from tuberculosis, and his mother moved in to help care for her. Despite their hopes, Ellen passed away at the age of 20. uttering her last words, "I have not forgotten the peace and joy." Emerson was strongly affected by her death and visited her grave in Roxbury every day. In a journal entry, he wrote, "I visited Ellen's tomb and opened the coffin." During this challenging time, Emerson served as junior pastor at Boston's Second Church, earning a steady income and fulfilling roles like chaplain for the Massachusetts legislature. However, his faith in conventional religious practices started to deteriorate. In 1832, he resigned from the ministry, believing the profession had become outdated and restrictive. He wrote, "I have sometimes thought that, in order to be a good minister, it was necessary to leave the ministry. The profession is antiquated." In search of clarity, Emerson traveled to Europe in 1833. He visited Italy, France, and England, where he met literary giants like Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Carlyle. However, it was his visit to Paris, at the Jardin des Plantes gardens, that left the most profound impact on him. The complexity of nature convinced him that everything in the world was interconnected, which led him to reject traditional theology in favor of a new perspective on life. By 1835, Emerson married Lydia Jackson and settled into a new life. He bought a house in Concord, which he named Bush. It is now open to the public as the Ralph Waldo Emerson House. He quickly became one of the leading citizens in the town. With a solid financial foundation, a new home, and a growing body of ideas, Emerson was fully prepared to embrace his role as a thinker, laying the groundwork for what would soon become the most defining philosophy of his life. The day before the publication of Nature, Emerson met with a group of like-minded intellectuals, including Frederick Henry Hedge, George Ripley, and George Putnam. Together, they discussed the possibility of forming a gathering for thinkers who shared similar philosophical ideas. This led to the creation of the Transcendental Club. A year later, Emerson invited women, including journalists like Margaret Fuller, into the group. This was a shift toward inclusivity. In 1836, Emerson anonymously published his first major work, the essay Nature, which laid the foundation for transcendentalist thought. He gave a famous speech called The American Scholar at Harvard a year later. After giving the speech, his friends encouraged him to publish it, so he printed 500 copies on his own, and they sold out in just a month. In the speech, Emerson asked Americans to create their own unique style of writing instead of copying Europe. James Russell Lowell, a Harvard student at the time, called it a big moment in American literature, while others who didn't understand it started calling it incoherent and unintelligible. Nature was the first true declaration of the movement. He proposed that divinity is not found in churches or institutions, but in the solitude of the natural world. He said, "In the woods, we return to reason and faith." In the late 1830s, Emerson's influence grew, and he became friends with Henry David Thoreau. He encouraged Thoreau to keep a journal, which became a key part of his work. Emerson himself was a devoted journal keeper. His journals are now considered some of his most important contributions to philosophy and literature. The success of this lecture inspired him to continue speaking, and soon he was one of America's most famous lecturers. He gave up to 80 lectures a year, often earning more from public speaking than from his books. His lectures reached large audiences, helping to spread transcendentalism to more people. During this time, Emerson was invited to Harvard Divinity School to deliver the school's graduation address, which came to be known as the Divinity School Address. Emerson discounted biblical miracles and proclaimed that while Jesus was a great man, he was not God. His comments outraged the establishment and the general Protestant community. He was denounced as an atheist and a poison to young men's minds. Despite the public outcry, Emerson chose not to respond. He was not invited back to speak at Harvard for another 30 years. In 1841, Emerson published his second major book, Essays, which included the famous essay, Self-Reliance. His aunt called it a strange medley of atheism and false independence. Despite the controversy, Emerson's ideas on self-reliance and independence established him as a major intellectual figure, and his works were groundbreaking, especially in Europe. Although his writing was successful, Emerson faced deep personal heartbreak with the death of his young son, Waldo. This loss led him to reflect more on the complexities of life and death. As time passed, Emerson continued to lecture and write on personal growth and transformation. His philosophy influenced figures like Nietzsche, Gandhi, and even the modern self-help movement. Yet it also raises a thought-provoking question. can complete self-reliance exist in a world that thrives on connection? Waldo was introduced to Indian philosophy through the French philosopher Victor Cousin. In 1845, his journals reveal he was reading the Bhagavad Gita and Henry Thomas Colebrooke's essays on the Vedas. Deeply influenced by Vedanta, Emerson explored its ideas in his essay, The Oversoul. He wrote, "We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. And this deep power in which we exist, and whose beatitude is all accessible to us, is not only self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the thing seen, the seer and the spectacle, the subject and the object are one. We see the world piece by piece, as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree, but the whole, of which these are shining parts, is the soul." In the later years of his life, Emerson's health began to decline. His writing slowed and he started experiencing memory problems, even suffering from aphasia. By the end of the 1870s, his mental state had deteriorated to the point where he sometimes forgot his own name. When asked how he was, he humorously replied, "Quite well. I have lost my mental faculties, but I am perfectly well." During this time, Emerson traveled on the newly completed Transcontinental Railroad. One of the highlights of his trip was visiting Yosemite, where he met the young, unknown naturalist, John Muir. This meeting would go on to be a significant moment in Muir's career. In the following years, Emerson's home in Concord was destroyed by fire. The fire destroyed much of the house, but Emerson and his neighbors tried to save as many belongings as possible. The family temporarily stayed with relatives. However, the fire marked the end of Emerson's regular lecture career. Afterward, he would only speak on special occasions and primarily in front of familiar audiences. In 1874, Emerson published Parnassus. The anthology included works from several poets, including works from his close friend, Thoreau. However, as his memory problems worsened, he stopped making public appearances, embarrassed by his inability to speak clearly. In a letter responding to an invitation, Emerson wrote, "I am not in a condition to make visits or take any part in conversation. Old age has rushed on me in the last year and tied my tongue and hid my memory, and thus made it a duty to stay at home." In April 1882, Emerson was diagnosed with pneumonia. He passed away just 6 days later. He was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts, in a coffin prepared by his friend. The end of his life marked the closing of an extraordinary era in American intellectual history, one defined by the very ideals he championed. As he once wrote, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment."